Welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 154, an interview with Dr. Scott Watson. Hi, welcome back to the Flute 360 podcast. These next 4 episodes, we are going to talk with 4 extraordinary composers in episodes 154 through 157. A little background information: these 4 musicians and I made contact through the Ultimate Music Business Summit hosted by Dr. Garrett Hope in January of 2021. Because of this event, I was able to make some wonderful music connections that have evolved into new friendships. This composer series brings me much joy because I get to share my new music friends with you. Learn from these aspiring musicians who give you gold nuggets that you can implement today. We talk about their flute compositions, how they perceive the flute voice, recording studio tips, and how to navigate a music career in our current climate. Lastly, I'd like to direct your attention to 2 great incentives that are going on right now. Flutistry Boston is giving you a 20% discount off of the book Survival of the Flutist by Marian Gidigian from now until March 31st, 2021. Use your Flute 360 code today to receive your discount. Lastly, Elizabeth Talbert is giving you a 20% discount off of her book, Applied Flute Practice Technique, from now until May 7th, 2021, when you use your Flute 360 code. Both links are provided in the show notes below. I would like to note that your purchase helps to support the Flute 360 podcast. If you would like to contribute to the podcast, this is a great way to do so. Thank you. Hi, Scott.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Hey. Sound okay on your end?
You sound great.
Excellent.
Cool. Well, how's your day been?
Normal day teaching in the Parkland School District. Yeah, fine. We're on the verge of going back, reopening our schools to 4 days. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. There's a school board meeting next week, and I from what I hear, reading the tea leaves, I think it's going to happen. So probably just the 4th marking period, kids will be back in school most of the week, not all week, but 4 out of the 5 days. Whereas right now, the ones that are in school are in what's called a hybrid. So the kids with last names A to L are Monday, Tuesday. Kids with last names M to Z are Thursday, Friday. Wednesday is this like e-learning day where, it's for helping intervention with weaker kids, things like that. And maybe having a one touch base Zoom a day rather than being with your kids all day.
Wow.
But it also gives teachers time to post content because we're doing a lot of that. We're generating tons of content and putting it up on our learning system. So anyway, it looks like this vote's going to happen next week, and we'll all find out, are we going back to school? Our kid, well, we've been in school all week, but are the kids going to come in every 4 days rather than just 2? I know a lot of parents, especially of elementary age kids, are very interested in that happening. And the vaccine's opening up more. There's a lot of the 1-dose Johnson & Johnson vaccine is now available to teachers. We could get vaccinated as soon as next week, actually. So all of those things seem to be leading to getting a little more normal to close the year out.
Nice.
The only problem is that every time we do something like that, we have to reschedule everybody. And so there's a lot of administrative stress that comes along with that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But it sounds like a lot of promising things are happening.
Yeah, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and I just hope, for the sake of our ensemble programs, that when we reopen in September, that it's much more like it had been always, and not much more like the can't meet in large groups kind of thing right now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm so thankful, like, when I look at, the different careers in our music world, right? Mm-hmm. My heart really went out the most to wind band directors.
Yeah.
I still can teach flute if it's one-on-one, and it's effective through remote lessons. but I can't imagine trying to organize and collaborate a band, especially the sizes of bands like in Texas.
Yeah.
Oh my
Right.
gosh.
I mean, we're seeing online some states are meeting. I just did a virtual composer residency with a band that's in Pennsylvania, but not in my region. They're up in the Poconos, and they're having 6 feet apart, wearing special wind instrument masks, and bell covers, and they're having their ensembles meet, and they're going to do their spring concert in the football stadium outside. So there's some people making it happen, and there's other people who've canceled all instrument, playing at all, and districts like mine are somewhere in the middle.
Huh. Wow. That's amazing. And it's kind of been interesting to see from afar, like how people and administrations and school boards are coming up with like creative solutions.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to kind of watch it all go down.
Yeah. So it's definitely, it's the hardest year this is my 36th year of teaching. And I would say maybe similar to my first year of teaching, which was also very stressful, that this would rank either first or second in terms of the most challenging, toughest year of teaching.
Oh, for sure. Bar none. Yeah. And like you said, hopefully we're through the woods and happier and sunnier days ahead.
Yeah.
Cool. So for the listeners who may not know you, can you share a little bit about your musical background and anything that you would like to offer us?
Sure. Well, let me tell you about what I do, and then if you want to probe like how I got into that background, I'm happy to go down that trail too. So I believe I'm here as a composer, which is part of what I do. I'm a composer right now of mostly music for ensembles, bands, school ensembles, bands, and concert bands and string orchestras. But I got my start with a master's in a DMA in composition from Temple University, was writing a lot of concert art music, chamber music and some orchestral stuff. But it just seemed like the work started coming from the band world. And that's why I ended up, most of the commissions were band directors who were interested in having me write for them. And so I went where the money is, if you will. But it's really it's a lot of fun. I mean, I love writing for winds and percussion, and at all levels too. I write for universities, high schools, middle schools, elementary, any level. But I also enjoy a commission here or there for a choir or for a chamber group too. So that's I'll write. I just love writing. But that sort of ties into, I believe, one of the reasons I was getting the work in the band world is because I'm also a music teacher, and I have been for 36 years now. My primary job over the past 35 years has been working in the Parkland School District in Allentown, Pennsylvania, as a band director. So because of all that experience and knowledge of what players can do at different levels, it's a little bit even better than, say, an orchestration class. And it's a lot less theoretical and a lot more pragmatic. I see what these kids do every day. So I think because of my insight as a band director, that's what I think made me attractive to other band directors to have me write for them.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I'm a composer, I'm a music teacher, and then I think an extension of that being a music teacher is some of the work I get to do as an adjunct, professor at some Philadelphia area universities, and as a clinician for my publisher, Alfred Music. So that's all teaching. So I do teaching as a day job, and then I do a lot of other kind of teaching that's related to that.
Yeah, you wear a lot of different hats.
Right,
yeah.
And it's fun.
Yeah.
Because I think I get bored if I was only doing one thing.
Yeah, that is true. Every day is very unique. So because you wear all of these different hats, you're right. Like we are picking your brain today about composition and composing. And so diving into that realm, what was your inspiration to begin composing?
Well, I had dabbled mostly with arranging back in high school, writing for some ensembles at school, like pep band or, talent show type stuff. But it wasn't, I think, until I was an undergraduate at Westchester University in Pennsylvania, which is a really good state school that has a great school of music. And that's where my high school trumpet teacher, who was a professor of trumpet there and the director of the wind ensemble, his name's Ken Laudermilk. sort of shepherded me into going to Westchester. And then while I was there, I started. I was really hardcore playing, thinking I would be a more of a performer as a trumpeter. But somewhere during that first couple of years, I think the allure of creating versus recreating, like as a trumpeter, you're recreating somebody else's music. But I started, arranging for my brass quartet and my brass quintet. And then I got a connection through my then girlfriend, now wife of 35 years, but she was a flute major. And so I would write for the flute ensemble there. And next thing you know, I'm writing for the chamber orchestra, the percussion ensemble. I mean, pretty much every ensemble, thankfully, that this isn't true at many universities where an undergraduate novice composer gets to write for all these ensembles and gets to actually have readings or actual performances by most of the major ensembles at a really good school of music. But that's exactly what happened. And it was really thrilling to, before I was out of school, to be winning a few competitions and getting some commissions and having people interested in my music. So I think that attention and that positive feedback from my undergraduate university years is what made me shift from seeing myself as a trumpeter to a composer. And then I went on to both master's and doctorate in composition.
Wow. Well, first, that was very well said.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that was awesome. And I love that idea of creation, recreation. I, of course, have thought of that, but the way you phrased it made me see it in a new light. So I thank you for that.
Oh, you bet.
Yeah. And it's funny where life takes you, and it reminds me of Eric. He's an audio guy, and he got into audio because he's recording his own blues guitar solos that he was making, his own lyrics, his own tunes, everything. And here we meet, we start dating, and next thing you know, throughout undergrad, master's, and then beyond, when we got married and into our professional careers, he gets hired 9 times out of 10 to record flutists' albums, right. Recordings for concerts, summer festivals, conventions, you name it. And every time he gets hired by another flutist, he will look at me and say, I cannot believe this is where my money's coming from. Like, never, when I started recording, I was thinking about recording blues artists or jazz or rock. And here life took him a whole different route.
Right.
But he loves it. And so he's now the flute recording guy. And so you just never know.
Yeah, I because of having taught for so long and having worked with so many students who wonder, what am I going to be as an adult, or what am I going to do, and how can I make those decisions? One illustration I use often is that, from their point of view, when they see the line that connects where they're at now to where they're going, it looks almost like a fractal. Those things with all these lines that veer off in one direction or another. But when you get to my point in life, there are definitely cuts and turns, but it's all just this one kind of you see why one path ended up opening up another door, and then that opened up this other door. It's a lot easier to look at it backwards, and all those options and turns, it becomes a little simpler and clearer. But yeah,
that is so true. Hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah, but also just that there's so many choices on the if you're an 18-year-old and you look ahead and think of the possibilities, there's infinite, right? And then when you, like, so for instance, in your husband's case, the being with a flutist and figuring out what mics work best and what recording schemes work best. I mean, that opened up a door, and then that's a straight line. So it's a lot less fractally, and it's a lot more straight liney. And the same thing is true with me, where my first published music was flute music. It was for my wife, who's also a flutist. And so I got a couple flute pieces published early on.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love it. I love how life unfolds, and you just never know what's right around the corner. Cool. So you mentioned that you work with Alfred Publications. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what's your role? I think you mentioned it. Let's dive into that a little bit more.
Right. So I'm what they call an exclusive composer, but that doesn't mean that I can't write for other companies. What it means is I have an assignment, or at least up until the pandemic, I had an assignment. They'd give me, 3, 4, 5 pieces a year to write for various level bands, and I could even submit beyond that. So, for instance, maybe in a given year, I'd have to write. An elementary band piece, 2 middle school band pieces, and 1 high school band piece. But then maybe I happen to write a string orchestra piece that year, and I'll submit that to the editor, and they may or may not pick up that. And so in that case, that piece is regarded more like I'm working as a freelance composer. So that's how I started with them, is I would just send them unsolicited manuscripts, and a couple of them got picked up, and then they'd say, hey, you have anything else? And every year for a few years, I was just sending them pieces hoping they'd get picked up. And then at one point or another, my then editor, Robert Sheldon, said, hey, we'd like to get you in a few more band rooms. We have an opening in our catalog. We'd like to sort of assign you some music at different levels. So would you be open to that? And I was like, gee whiz, I don't have to think hard about yes, just knowing that the music I write will actually get, played and published. So I think that was a nice vote of confidence in me from them. And hopefully it was mutually beneficial that the music's sold well for them and whatnot. So going into the pandemic, that's what I was doing. And since the pandemic, everything's really shut down, and a lot of the big publishers like Hal Leonard and Alfred just aren't, people aren't performing ensemble music, so they're not moving it, and they're all trying to think of, what's a response? How can we help educators? How can we help student musicians? What should we be doing now? So I'm not employed by Alfred, but I'm an exclusive composer for Alfred, and I play a part in their catalog every year.
Okay, cool. Thanks for clarifying that.
And I'm also a clinician, which also started a few years ago, where they would send me out to do, PD workshops for band directors, things like that.
Oh, very neat. Yeah, thanks for that insight. If you're just not in that world, how do you know? And it's cool to see, behind the scenes through Alfred. Yeah.
And they're great. I've met so many wonderful and talented people who either directly are employed or just are in their sphere. Midwest Clinic in Chicago every December would be a place where we're all together, and you just can't even believe you're sitting at the same table with these luminary conductors and iconic composers that you've always admired, and they're just all around. It's a neat atmosphere.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that being true. Even in our world, like at the National Flute Association, and you look around, you're like, oh, cool, I'm presenting at the same convention as, so-and-so. Right. Yeah. And my dorky flute side will definitely come out in that scenario.
No, I think there was, since we came across one of those paths, I've listened to a few of your episodes, especially ones that have a Philadelphia connection. So I think you interviewed Erica Peel in a recent episode. And weren't you at a convention where she was there or something like that? Yeah,
maybe. I can't quite remember the dialogue, but yeah, even at the National Flute Association, the last one we had was in 2019 in Salt Lake City. And being asked to come out and share the same booth as William S. Haynes Flute Company.
Wow.
That was a big deal. And I said, oh my gosh, somebody pinched me. I'm sitting next to these people, and these are people that I've always admired. And then getting to collaborate with them on a professional level, it's like, woo, am I dreaming? So I totally get that feeling.
Yeah.
Oh, neat. Very cool. So you mentioned the pandemic and how the arts and Alfred Publications were having to, navigate and get creative with said problem and find solutions. So in our previous talk, when you and I were getting to know each other, you mentioned something about flex bands. Can you talk more about this?
That is a big word right now. So the idea is that, some of the students who would have played in our band programs this year have chosen not to, or their families have chosen not to out of fear, various reasons. But thankfully, a lot of that's starting to turn around. People are getting a little more comfortable, and they've seen that the sensible precautions that school programs have taken allow kids to have that outlet of playing music in school. And thank God, too. I tell you what, the kids I work with, I can just tell when they come down that they're just so glad to be doing something something normal, like playing their instrument, even if we have to be doing it outside or 6 feet apart or whatever. But anyway, the Flex band, I don't know if it's a movement now, but it's certainly on everybody's the tip of everybody's tongues, and that's instrumentations that can work regardless of the instrumentation you have. So whereas I normally would score a high school band piece for say 20 or 24 different instruments, I'll write a piece in Alfred's new Flex series where it can work if you have any 4 instruments. It could be a flute, an alto sax, a trombone, and a bell kit. Something it doesn't matter what 4. So it's just basically distilling everything in that arrangement or in that composition to 4 unique parts that can be covered by any instrument. And Alfred has actually 2 versions of their Flex series. It's for any 4 instruments or any 5. What they do with percussion is so it's any 4 tonal wind instruments and then some percussion parts. They also make a percussion play-along track available for free download from their website. So if you have no percussion or if you only have one of the percussion parts, you can still have your 4. So say you have 37 kids in a band that you used to have like 70, and now you only have 37 kids and the instrumentation isn't great. You can still do ensemble music and aesthetically interesting. So I'm really proud of the pieces I wrote for them. So I think they are aesthetically interesting, and yet they work for a very flexible instrumentation, hence the term Flex band. And you've got that play-along track that you can download, so your percussion is there if you don't have it. And that also facilitates these virtual ensembles that a lot of us directors are making, where we record students independently to a click track and then combine them all together. So you could add that percussion track if you do that kind of a virtual ensemble. So it's very adaptable to a lot of different settings. And Flex ensembles existed before the pandemic. They're just becoming, because there's all in certain bands that just didn't have, one reason or other, they didn't have an ideal instrumentation, but they wanted to do good, aesthetically interesting music. So that kind of music has been out there minimally, but now it's like that's the big thing. So. So that's one thing that Alfred's done. And they have a couple other initiatives, too, if you want to hear about it. But,
for sure. No, I think it's amazing. And before we dive into their other solutions or innovative projects that they're working on, my question with the Flex bands from a compositional standpoint, as a composer, what challenges have you noticed or had to overcome when writing for a Flex ensemble?
Oh, my gosh. So I don't know how wonky and detailed you want to get, but like, for instance, you can't just do, or you can, and actually some publishers do, like they'll say, here's a B flat part. So that covers like everything from B flat clarinet, B flat trumpet, B flat tenor sax. Or what Alfred has chosen to do is have like B flat high, B flat low. So for instance, the tenor sax at a middle school, a typical middle school tenor sax has a range of such and such, but that might not be the same as the middle school clarinet's range, which is also a B flat instrument. So when you look at distilling the artistic intent of a composition to just 4 parts, and then you look at, okay, how do I make a part that works for anyone? Like, so that if you only had 4 clarinets, there's got to be a clarinet 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, okay, clarinet 1 can play high notes, what they call above the break. They're advanced enough. But let's say clarinet 2 can't. So then it turns out that to come up with music that works for any 4 instruments, a lot of sort of clearing the path for all sorts of things that could go wrong in certain band rooms across the country with certain levels of player. It's an amazing amount of editing and thinking through. All the composers who are writing these Flex arrangements, at least at Alfred, are very experienced band directors like myself that have decades of working with kids at all levels. And so we don't want to just send a part out there that, a director thinks it'll work with their 4 clarinets, but wait a second, my second clarinet can't play this. They can't play above the break. So it takes a lot of, trial and error, sending it back and forth between the editor and the composer to come up with parts that actually work for players at the certain levels. But that kind of restrictions, that kind of borders or boundaries around a project, I have to say I embrace that. That's what a commission is. Every time I get contacted by a band director who says, "Hey, we're opening up an arts wing, and could you write a new piece for our high school band?" Oh, and we don't have any you name it, like oboe, or we don't have any bassoon, or we have a very large percussion section this year. Can you write for 12 percussionists or whatever? Those kind of parameters that sort of, you would think they limit your writing, but they actually, I think, help me as a composer move forward. And that thought, by the way, is not original. I've been teaching composition in recent years, and I often refer to a series of lectures that Stravinsky gave at Harvard back in the 30s. And those talks were collected into a book called Poetics of Music. But one of the things that one of the major points of his talks was about having parameters that are like walls around a composer, and you might push up against the wall, you might push the envelope a little bit, but actually staying inside those walls helped him to be creative. Think about when he was writing, how many different schools, there was 12-tone, there was Impressionism, there was Expressionism, there was Pandiatonicism. There were so many different things, like literally infinite number of ways you could compose. And I guess what he was saying is, I'm going to put some restrictions around my writing, and that's going to help me move forward creatively. So I call it, when I teach composition to younger students, I call it the Stravinsky paradox, the idea that boundaries actually make you more creative, not less creative. And that's kind of what I'm getting at with the flex band arrangements, is give me a set of restrictions, and it actually helps me move forward. I love it. And I'm glad that we are on the same page, because I was literally going to quote Stravinsky. But no, that's good, because we're on the same brainwave. Yeah, great. But you're right. There's a lot of truth to that. And yeah, thanks for sharing those insights with what you're finding, within this world of composing for flex bands. Yeah. I think it's brilliant. And as an educator, if someone can solve, a pain point of, I have weird instrumentation over here, Yep. It just blows my mind when people come up with innovative projects like this. Not to sound redundant, but seriously, like flex bands, like, to me, it just sounds so simple, but at the same time, a lot of creative thought went behind that. And then to bring it to life, it's mind-blowing. It was really a summer-long. The new editor at Alfred for Concert Band, and actually for all the education products, is a fellow named Chris Bernatas, a former band director from Northern Jersey. But Chris, when he initiated the idea and sent around basically like brainstorming emails to me and some other composers who he wanted to involve, it was like maybe 2 months of nonstop, just like these really long emails. But what about this? Well, what if this happens? But what about this? And coming up with, what would the score look like? What kind of score will help the director the most? And again, I think Alfred came up with a really unique format for that, and a tips section about, here's the suggested instrumentation and things like that. But there was so much to think through. So we're really happy. I'm very proud of the music that I wrote for that series, and again, I was so glad to be involved doing something. Just number one, composers need to compose, right? You don't feel like yourself when you're not writing. Plus, the education community needed stuff like that, so it felt good to be doing it. Very cool. So you mentioned some other innovative projects that Alfred is working on. Do you want to elaborate on that? Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the Soloist series is another one that they started, again, thinking that people are at home, learning online, in partnership with Smart Music. Maybe you're aware of that, the intelligent accompaniment app that sort of accompanies you and tells you whether you're playing notes right or wrong. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of Smart Music? So Smart Music and Alfred together sort of did this Soloist series, and composers wrote pieces for instrument-specific solos. Like, so for instance, I wrote one of the flute solos. It's called Monarch, and it's written at what in the band world we call a grade 4, like a solid high school piece. And then I also wrote an oboe solo called Sur la Glace, and that's more of a grade 2, 2.5, like maybe a good middle school player, or just an easier high school read. And then I wrote a third solo that worked for any band instrument. So that's in a sense kind of like a flex thing, and that's a solo called Mustang Spirit. And it was actually a commission from a school whose mascot is the Mustang. So, So all of and there's a dozen or so other composers who each did 2 or 3 solos each too. So all of these solos are now in Smart Music, or as they're coming out, they're in Smart Music. I think right now only the generic ones that work for any instrument are coming out this spring, and then over the summer, all the instrument-specific ones like Monarch will come out. But what'll be neat about that is that people can go right to Smart Music and have a pianist accompanying them, and they can hear their flute part played as well, or their whatever instrument. And they can do the digital download at totalsheetmusic.com and things like that. So it really works well. Smart Music integrates well with remote learning, and a lot of directors are using that for their kids that are at home that they're teaching. So the Soloist series is one. And then another thing Alfred launched over the early fall is a series of self-contained lessons that are taught by Alfred, composers and clinicians. So, for instance, I created a lesson on scale and mode. What is scale and mode? And then I use some of my own music to explain the topic. And then there's a little creative assignment. There's these downloadable PDFs so students can do like a little composition that uses the idea of scale and mode. And the lessons are video lessons. So I'm on video teaching it. So basically, it's a prepackaged remote lesson that, say, a band director who found themselves, like many did at the start of the fall, teaching band, but not actually being able to play their instruments. So what can we do? Well, let's teach them about scale and mode and have them do this creative assignment that Watson walks them through. So there's a bunch of lessons under a series called Compose Yourself. That's the series. And so one lesson is on rhythm, one lesson's on form, but I did the scale and mode one. So I think those are really well done and a help too.
What great resources. That's amazing. And Smart Music is phenomenal. I've been using Smart Music for years. Yeah, and then I remember seeing about that scale and mode. I think you published something through LinkedIn, and
I probably shared about it on LinkedIn. Sure.
Oh, so yeah, thank you for showcasing those resources, and I hope people who hear this episode actually get to use and utilize those resources to your advantage.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So moving on, you were talking about commissions and being commissioned to write a certain piece for an art gallery opening or, etc.
Yeah.
So
You want to hear my most unique commission I've ever received?
Sure.
So about a year and a half ago, I was asked to write a piece that would celebrate the concrete industry in Northampton, Pennsylvania.
Whoa.
And it's like, what? But apparently this school had been trying to get me to write for them a couple of years in a row, but they kept going to their administration and they wouldn't get the money approved. They said, no, that's too much to spend on just one piece of music. They didn't see like how cool this would be to have somebody write just for their kids and whatever. So they went to the local historical society, and it turns out that town was built on the concrete industry back in like 1910, like turn of the century industrial kind of. So their local historical society said, we'll fund the project, but it needs to be about cement, so again, I embraced that. I went and toured their cement museum they have in town and spent a whole day with the guy he was like a retired history teacher who that's like what he was doing in his retirement, was just talking about how important this was to founding this town and making their community feel like a community. And anyway, he just really mesmerized me with how much he was into cement and the history of cement. And I came away with some ideas, so like that idea of creative problem solving. And okay, I got to write a piece and it's got to celebrate the cement industry in Northampton, right? All right, we're going to make it work. We're going to find a way. So
what a stitch. Oh my gosh, that cracks me up. Oh, shoot. So did you use a lot of percussive instruments or?
I did. Yeah. So he was showing me at the museum some of these old black and white pictures from turn of the century, industrial age kind of factories. And it was a gritty but mechanical world. And I was just hearing what this factory must have sounded like in its heyday. And so I wrote a piece called Rock Solid. Rock, because it's a double entendre there, right? Rock being cement, but also it is sort of a rock beat, but it's like nothing you've ever heard. It's truly not like what we think of when we think of rock, but it does have that rock pulse. And then what I did was I used a lot of harmonies. I borrowed appropriated some harmonies that, what were composers at the heyday, like 1920, this town was literally the cement capital of the world. So what kind of harmonies would you be hearing in the 1920s, like blues and things like that? So I kind of synthesized that kind of harmonic language, early 20th century popular and jazz music into like my own sort of, concert art music, classical sort of idiom. And so imagine a rock piece that uses that kind of harmonic language and has all sorts of mechanical, metallic and other percussion things happening. That became the piece Rock Solid.
Wow. Brilliant.
It was a lot of fun to write. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I have not heard of a story similar to yours, so you top.
I got a million of them, by the way, because every commission is like that. Maybe it's not so bizarre. Like when I say celebrates the cement industry, it just makes me laugh. But every commission does have some unique thing, like it's got to be a composer. Or I remember one time I had a commission that it was a vocal piece, and it had to be a poem from a poet from Boston or somewhere in Massachusetts, I think it was, or so there's always some kind of like, you can't just write what you want. I mean, that rarely happens. And by the way, if somebody commissioned me and said, just write whatever you want, that actually is a little harder because now it's like, oh my gosh, I got an infinite number of choices. I kind of like the idea of these parameters forcing me into a shoot and helping me move forward creatively.
Yeah, it's kind of like sitting down at the hair salon and you tell your stylist, oh, just do anything. And they just don't want to be sued later that, they went totally pixie cut on you and you didn't want to go that short, so.
Yep.
So in general, you've kind of already tackled this topic, so feel free to say, we've already talked about it. But when you're not being commissioned then, or when you are being commissioned, in general, what does your compositional process look like?
Well, no, that's a good question. I think we can talk about some other things that I didn't hit on because, like I shared earlier, in the last couple of years, I've been doing more composition teaching. As it turns out, some of the adjunct teaching for like Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and a couple other places have asked me to teach some composition lessons. So I've, you know what the old saying that when you teach something, you really learn it better, or at least you have to think about how you're going to present it. So I have had to think about the process more, and I know in my own composition journey, my process has sort of pivoted a lot as I've gotten older. So let me summarize this by saying 3 quotes. I'll give you 3 quotes that I think summarize part of the process and especially how I've pivoted. So one of the quotes is by a fellow named Linus Pauling. He's like I think he's a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. But anyway, he has this quote: "The best way to have a great idea is to have many ideas." So if you come up with enough ideas, chances are one of them is going to be good, right?
There you go.
Or the old a broken clock is right twice a day, that kind of thing. So I keep sketchbooks. Like I have on the shelf that's right next to me. I must have 7 or 8 manuscript, old style manuscript paper sketchbooks that I just write ideas as they come to me, like when I'm driving home from work or when I'm going on a walk or whenever. And they're usually just really short little generative ideas, like maybe a rhythmic gesture or a harmonic progression or a melody. And I'll look at them later and 90% of them are just unremarkable crap, right?
Okay.
I'll throw them out and I won't use it. But 10% of them, I'll say, I could do something with this. So that's part of it. It's just having a lot of ideas you're going to eventually come up with. So, and then even when I'm working on, like when I was working on that project, Rock Solid, I probably had 3 or 4 different approaches that I had sketched out as I started to develop ideas. And I just sort of sat on it and let it germinate for a while. So I do a lot of sketching. So that's the one quote: "The best way to have a great idea is to have many." Another quote is one that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln. It might be apocryphal, but I still love it anyway. He said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I'll spend the first 4 sharpening my axe." And this is the pivot I've made. When I was younger, I would sit at the piano with pencil and manuscript paper, and I would just write everything that came into my mind. And then I'd end up having to edit it and remove, 80% of it and just rewrite some other stuff and rework it. And it looked like what I imagined Beethoven's manuscripts look like, really a lot of scribbling out and just a very tortured, piece of paper with all sorts of rewrites and edits and everything. What I do now is when I get a commission like that Northampton one about the cement factory, I'll think about it for 3 months, just ruminating on what I want the piece to be. I'll go to my sketchbook maybe, or I'll start sketching ideas. But until I have that whole piece more or less figured out in my head, I don't even try to write it. So when I actually go to write it, I can write it in a day or two, or I can write it in a week. It comes a lot faster because I've spent so much time just figuring it out and envisioning it in my head and working it out and mapping it out and thinking about what gestures and devices I want to incorporate. So after all of that time, when I go to write it, the writing comes a lot faster and a lot more clean. So I call that process, those 3 months of sketching and experimenting and thinking, I call that pre-composition, but it's a huge part of my process.
Oh my gosh. I feel validated now that I'm aging more gracefully than I thought I was. Because the older I'm getting as a flutist, I will just sit and think, and I will mentally think through the piece. I will sing it in my head, sometimes out loud or sometimes internally. Sometimes I'm just walking around the room to see how it feels in my body. And then maybe after 4, 5, 6 different, steps, then I'll pick up the flute.
Sure.
And that's one thing that I wished I would have had in my toolbox when I was a younger flutist. I find myself like, I'm only 35, but I feel like, a lot of my students are 15, so they're about 20 years younger than me. And I'll tell them, like, we're 2 decades apart, and I feel like this grandma at 95 telling them, like, slow down, take it easy, But when I work with these 15-year-olds, I'm like, you're young, you want to get through, and, time is everything to you, and there might not even be a sense of time to them, but the older I get, the more I realize how precious my time is.
Sure.
And I really want to be efficient with it. And so I find, instead of me breaking my back and trying to play through licks over and over and over again, I mean, at some point it's like, this is really not efficient and this is not working. Let me mentally practice it. Let me think through it. Let me sing through it. And so I find myself telling these younger students all the time, like, breathe, relax, enjoy the process, like, approach it without the flute. And so hearing that, I just get goosebumps because we're in this music community together, but you have your own little niche of, composition, and I'm not in that world. But to see the parallels between performance and composing and how similar these processes can be is really cool to me.
Yeah. And I don't think it's original to me. In fact, when I listened to the Daniel Dorff episode, another Philadelphia connection that you have had in your podcast, I think he said something along the same lines. I know and I think it's older composers. I think it's a process you have to go through. So when I share it with young undergraduate composers in some of the teaching I do, I realize that maybe they're not there yet. I don't, force them to have that pre-composition stage. I just say, hey, this is how I do it.
Okay.
There's many ways up the mountain, but I just feel like it's worth sharing. Maybe the light will click on for some of them, and then that'll be something that's useful to them. But it could be that they, just like me, have to go through a years-long process of arriving there.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good reminder for me to hear from the experienced educator that you are to more of a newbie of me. It's good to hear that insight from you to let me give them permission to find their way and let them do their thing, but of course, guide them along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. Thanks for sharing those insights. Very cool.
Oh, I wanted to give you a third quote too.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. No. So the third quote is Bernstein. He said, inspiration is wonderful when it happens, but the writer must develop an approach for the rest of the time. So what he's pointing out is, like, most people think of composers like sitting at the piano and getting hit with a jolt of inspiration lightning that all of a sudden, I mean, movies like Amadeus, right, make us think this is the way it happens. But every composer I know is less like Mozart in Amadeus and more like just a craftsman who's building a fine piece of furniture and has got a plan and has got to polish that leg and sand that corner and do all the things that. So the part about develop an approach for the rest of the time is I have a whole repertoire or bag of tricks of compositional devices, and the more I write and the longer I've been around music and the more other people's good music that I study, the more I pick up those things. So I'll just give you an example of one. Like, if I want something to really be a big hit in a piece, if I really want to have the audience go, wow, sit back and just have the hair raised. Usually what I'll do is right before that big hit, I'll have absolute silence. I'll have everybody drop out just for a minute or, for a beat or two, not a minute, I'm sorry, for a beat or two. And all of a sudden it's like you're like, wait, what's happening? And then boom, like the big hit, right? So like that's that example of a dropout before a big hit is a composition device. It's a I don't want to call it a trick or like I'm trying to manipulate my audience. Well, I guess I am.
Yeah.
I'm trying to have them like buy into that climax more by having silence right before it. And so, the more you write, the more you get dozens, if not hundreds of these devices that when you're writing a piece, it seems like, oh, I'll try this here. I think that would work really well. And in that sense, I do feel like I'm more of a craftsman, like, arts and crafts. I feel like the art part is maybe the two measures that I wrote in the sketchbook, but the craft part is putting it all together and knitting a piece and, coming up with what Bernstein called the approach for the rest of the time.
Okay. No, I love that. That's amazing. Very cool. We can start talking about this now. Since you are a composer and you have such a great catalog, is there a particular piece that you would like to mention? Or I don't think you can choose because they probably are all your babies, but but is there a favorite? Is there a particular piece that resonates with you more so than the others?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. In some way, asking a composer what their favorite piece is like asking a parent which child they like best. You know? But it's not that morally reprehensible. There are pieces that I'm more proud of years out, especially since I would say a lot of what I write, even 1 or 2 years after I write it, I think, oh, I wish I could do that again because I would have done this. My editor at Alfred used to say, that's a snapshot of where you were at, and he's very much more. Philosophical about it, and I appreciate that. But anyway, some pieces that I've written years and years and years ago, like I think 1992, I wrote Aesop's Fables, which is for wind ensemble and narrator, and the narration is 4 of those moral tales by Aesop, right, attributed to Aesop, like the tortoise and the hare. And I just still am tickled when I get to guest conduct that, when I'm invited to a band, a wind ensemble that's performing it, and I get to just come hear somebody else play it, or sometimes they'll ask me to come conduct it. I love conducting the piece. I'm very proud of the music, and I think it's just a really well put together piece. So that's one of, like, that would be an example of something that I'm very proud of. If your listeners want to hear some of my music at scottwatsonmusic.com, you can hear audio examples, really good recordings of all my music. But another one is I wrote a trumpet concerto, and it's in 3 movements, but the middle movement is just this very meditative, slow. It's not hard to play as a trumpeter. It's actually just kind of a tone piece. But the middle movement of my concerto for trumpet and orchestra, I just am really proud of that. And let's try to think of some other pieces. Just for flute, my very first published piece is a piece I told you about before called 5 Carols for Flute and Piano.
Yes. And
I hate to call them arrangements. Like I usually use the word settings because they're inspired or informed by these old world carols like the Holly and the Ivy, or Bring a Torch, Jeanette Isabella, things like that. But they have sort of a contemporary harmonic language nonetheless. And I wrote the 5 Carols for Flute and Piano as a Christmas gift for my wife back in 1998. So this is, again, an older piece. And when I hear it played today, I still am very proud of it. And they're nice little miniatures. They're not, each one is only, a minute to 2 minutes long. And they're just very kind of haiku-ish. They're miniatures. And I'm very happy with the way it turned out. It turned out to not only launch my career publishing, but it also has brought me into a lot of churches and nursing homes and other places where things like 5 Carols for Flute and Piano get to be played. It's also been played at the White House, by the way. So
no way.
Yeah. There was a flutist from Louisville who played it. I think she was with that orchestra too. So some pretty high-powered flute players have played it. There's a duo in Princeton that's flute and harp. It also works for harp, by the way. In fact, it's published under the name 5 Carols for Flute and Piano or Harp. So there's a duo, flute and harp, that's played them and recorded them in Princeton, New Jersey. But yeah, one of the president's own, a flute player with the president's own, emailed me years ago to say, hey, I played this for Bill Clinton at Christmas time in the White House. So there's some pieces that have held up, and I'm really happy that I get to hear them played by other people that are enjoying them even today.
Oh, cool. Speaking of flutists, since you are married to a flutist and your daughter is a flutist. You're a brass guy here, but you've been around flute and you're a composer. So obviously you write for flute in your wind bands and flute solo works and things like that. I'm curious, just from your perspective of those different roles that you carry, how do you perceive the flute? Like the voice that it carries, the spirit that it carries, however you want to call it. How do you perceive the instrument, and then how does that carry into your compositions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that would be that question for every instrument. That could be a whole book right there. But anyway, as you mentioned, my wife is a flutist. My daughter is a flutist as well. And so it's kind of personal for me that I know, people close to me who play flute. I really trust their instincts. A lot of times when I'm writing a band piece, I'll have my daughter Abby or my wife Kim look over the flute part or come play it or listen to finales, which has some pretty good soft synth rendering, but not as good as a real flute player, right? But I'll have them, go over it and give me some suggestions. And when I think of flutes, I think of specific people like my wife and my daughter and some other flutists I've known. And I'll tell you what, at their height, I mean, my wife isn't practicing, say, as much as she did when she was, really, thinking of more of a performer flutist. Yeah. She still can really bless a lot of people at our church and whatnot, but she would be the first to tell you. But I'll tell you what, in her heyday, I could write anything. I could write anything for her. So, and my daughter was very technical too, although she sort of, if I had to say the difference between Abby and Kim, is Abby had more of a, a velvety, lovely tone, whereas Kim was more technical. But anyway, the two of them are nice to have as consultants. And I feel like of all the instruments in band, even though I'm a brass player and even though I was a half decent trumpeter at one time, probably flute is the instrument I feel the most comfortable writing for. I think of flutists as undaunted by technical demands. So I feel much more free writing for flute than almost any other instrument, even including trumpet, because of my wife's influence on me, I think.
That makes sense. No, and that's awesome. And I asked that question because when you get into this flute world and you're around flutists and flute callings so much, we kind of share the same language, and it's great and that's why I'm doing this series, talking with composers, because I think 2 years ago, I did my first composer series with Danny Dorff and Gary Schocker, and the series was just a hit. People loved getting into y'all's world. They just absolutely loved it. And they kept asking, like, when are you going to do another composer series? And so this is when here I'm going full circle again and doing round 2. And so anyways, I say all of that because I ask, when you're talking with flutists and performers and teachers so much, we use the same language. And when I get to step outside of my world for a moment, like our conversation now, and get to talk with the brass guy and a composer, I want to hear how you perceive the flute and what language you're using around the instrument, because that could inspire us flutists to maybe have new words to motivate us or to think about or to ponder. Yeah, so that's why I asked that question. And like Gary Schocker, like years ago, he is a flutist, but he's also a composer. And he goes, for me, like the flute should float. Yeah. And when he said that word, I was just like, that makes a lot of sense. I love that. And so just language is powerful, Yeah. Floating versus another word. It holds different weight, or lack of weight. Yeah. But, hearing these adjectives and the way people describe something can really light your light bulb, and just go, oh, wow, I didn't think of it that way before. And so that's the basis of my question.
Well, the same could be said with titles. Like, so when I was writing that flute, and I was really happy to be chosen to write the flute solo for Alfred's series. And I think they did it knowing that I had some other flute pieces already published. But, coming up with the idea of monarch and what does a butterfly do? It flits around, but it also just sits on a leaf in the sun and just like basks with its wings wide open. Like those word pictures actually help me, at least. And I think a lot of composers, it helps us figure out what's the musical analog now? How am I gonna portray that? And not that all music has to be programmatic,
right?
But I think those words are, at least for a composer like me, they're very helpful.
Yeah, and my disclaimer to Gary's quote there, like I'm pretty sure not every piece the flute should float. Like there's a lot of like heavy hitters like Prokofiev or something,
right.
So in context. But yeah, it just gets the wheels turning.
Yeah. But anyway, my experience writing for flutists has been 100% positive. And if any of your listeners want to reach out, I'd love to talk about projects. But writing for flutists is so fun because they, like I said, they're kind of dauntless. They don't have as much fear about technique and or game for anything.
Yeah, we're a special breed.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. So in the last segment of the show, I do a fun segment called Picks. It can be anything under the sun. It could be your favorite cereal, book, movie, you name it.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. You can share away.
So I'll go with books, unless I can think of something else, just because I am a reader. I wasn't when I was a lot younger, but boy, that's one of my favorite things to do. And it just gives you perspective because a book will take you to a place or a time, a realm that you don't know very much about. And that's one thing the world could use a lot more of is just understanding and perspective. So let me tell you about the last two books I read. Right now I'm reading a book called Heir of the Founders. It's by H.W. Brands. And it's all about the second generation of American statesmen. So the statesmen who followed, like the Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams, that next crop. And those were people, Henry Clay from Kentucky, and John Calhoun from South Carolina and Daniel Webster from Massachusetts. And it's a great pocket of history that I didn't know much about. So it's before the Civil War. But it's after that, founding time. And it was the country just wrestling with what does it mean to be America? What does it mean to be the United States? And so there's a lot of great sort of subtopics. And again, I don't want to get too technical about it, but if you're a kind of a history wonk like I am, it's a great book. But I'll just tell you a funny thing that just cracked me up is that this was a time. Okay, so we're talking about like 1820, say. This is a time when the primary way that these statesmen were portrayed to the country earlier in their life was paintings, these really romanticized paintings that just showed them in all their glory, almost made them look like Roman gods in these paintings, right? By the end of their life, the primary way that people were portrayed was in photos. Like think of those photos you've seen of Abraham Lincoln, right? Those old black and white. So in the book, they have both the paintings and they have the photos. And so I'm reading through the book, thinking about these great iconic statesmen and seeing these romanticized paintings of them until you get to a certain page and all of a sudden it's like, what? They start looking like these really freakish, gaunt, very gritty, realistic, worn out gentlemen whose hair is just all like you're like, okay, the painting really romanticized them. And it made me think that's probably the way we think about, the old days, the golden old days were so great, but really they were these like, shockingly raw, people had to go through a lot of things back then that are probably at least as trying as the things we're going through right now. So that's the one book. Another book that I read earlier in the fall is called The Splendid and the Vile. And it's by Eric Larson, who's one of my favorite authors. He's written a lot of books that they're all not just based on history, but they are historic, but he tells them like a novelist. So they're just really well written, compelling page turners about things that really happened, and nothing is fictionalized. It's all true. But this one, The Splendid and the Vile, is about Winston Churchill's first year as Prime Minister of England. And so this is the year that led up to them entering World War II. And it was the perfect book for the fall because it made, again, perspective. It made me realize as bad as things are now, at least I didn't have my whole block, blitzkrieg bombed by the Luftwaffe. And there's a dog walking around the street holding the dismembered arm of a child.
Wow.
And the policemen are seeing all this and trying to put out fires. And it was just a terrible, terrible time. It was a horrific time. And Winston Churchill's approach, for better or worse, was that, keep calm and we're going to press on. And so it kind of made me feel like when I went into the schools in September, when I re-entered teaching after the summer we all had to go through, it was to just try to give kids hope and be optimistic about, you know what, around the corner. We're going to be back to normal. We're going to be okay. It's going to be cool. And just smile and kind of be the Winston Churchill to the students I teach. And so it was the perfect book for the time. But I think it's a good book anyway, if you're into history.
Oh, cool. Thanks for those recommendations. Yeah. And side note, well, not side note, but I feel the need to say that since you brought up turmoil and challenges and you going into the band room and keeping on a smiley, happy face for your students and stuff, your students are so blessed to have you as a teacher. And thank you for all of, the wonderful impact that you put into our community and your output. And it's astounding. So I thank you for that.
No, you're very welcome. It's a privilege to do it. It's kind of like a mission. It's what I feel like God is calling us all to do something, right? And that's mine.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, we all have God-given talents and a purpose to serve on this world and on this earth, and finding it and fulfilling it is a treasure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, since you mentioned books, I will piggyback off of that, and I have a pick of my own.
Ooh, great.
Yeah.
I have my pencil ready.
Yay, yes. Speaking of books, if you ever, and this goes to you, Scott, or to the listener, if anybody is listening to this and you guys want to join the Flute 360 book club, feel free to join us once a month, and we pick a book through a poll, and then we read it and then meet up and talk about it. So There's that invitation. Off of that, we are starting our third book, called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. I'll put in the show note links, but I've started it and it's really wonderful. There's all sorts of gatherings, right? Social gatherings for ceremonies such as funerals, weddings, birthdays, parties, you name it. And she basically goes through and asks, what's at the heart of the gathering? Is it the fancy dinner table? Or is it the conversation and the people? And so she offers a really neat perspective to this whole notion of gathering and what that means. And I really like her insights.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the first book we read, you would love this, Scott. I can almost bet on it. So the title of that book is called Counterpoint, a Memoir of Bach and Mourning by Philip Kennycott. And it was phenomenal. The author weaved together his own personal story of his relationship between him and his mother, his childhood, his studies in piano, and basically his mother's passing on and her life, her legacy, the challenges she faced, and this duo, theme of life and death, and finding the parallels between those themes and Bach's music. He goes through the Goldberg variations, different violin sonatas. Yeah, it's phenomenal. So I give that 5 out of 5.
I'm getting it.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, you know why? It reminds me of Douglas Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, and Eternal Golden Braid. Same kind of finding analogies outside of Bach to both math and to Escher's the Dutch print master, so to visual art, math, and then also there's a little Lewis Carroll in there, so there's a little writing. But anyway, I'll bet you it's going to be a great read. So thank you for that recommendation.
Oh, for sure. My pleasure. Awesome, Scott. Well, it's been amazing to pick your brain and just see your vast professional career. And I'm just so glad that you spent time with us to share your insights about composing and our flute world.
No, it was a pleasure. It's the convergence of things I love: music, flute, books. You put it all in there. So it was a lot of fun. Hey, can I mention my YouTube channel too?
Oh, feel free.
The reason I say that is because as a composer who didn't have as much traditional work this past year, I was very grateful for some of the projects I got to be involved in. But I had a little time on my hands, so I ended up just putting up a lot of content on my YouTube channel. And a lot of that is, lessons and illustrations and demonstrations and things that I've done over the past, 36 years teaching. So it's pretty worked out and distilled. So I've made video versions of those, and it turns out some of it I was going to do anyway for my own students, but some of it just was a lot of fun. I got kind of the bug. I kind of got into video production and thought, this is a lot of fun. So I took some of my creativity that would have been in writing pieces and put up videos on Bach or on what is rhythm or things like that.
Oh, nice. Well, I am already subscribed through your YouTube channel, so you have one extra subscriber.
Excellent.
But I will definitely put the YouTube channel link in the show notes so that everyone can access it very easily.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you inviting me on. I like all podcasts. They just are stimulating, and it's great for when you go on walks and things like that to hear, rather than just pablum, to hear something like what you're doing. So,
bravo thank you.
For your podcast, and thanks for having me on.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. Please subscribe to the Flute 360 newsletter by going to HeidiKBegay.com. A pop-up will appear and you can enter in your information for the weekly newsletter. The newsletter includes great incentives, updates, and perks to the subscribers. Go ahead to HeidiKBegay.com and sign up today. Thank you.